Why would a man with no criminal record rain bullets on a crowd of strangers? I still remember the first time I saw the footage. Las Vegas, October 1st, 2017. 58 lives ended in minutes. Hundreds injured. Thousands traumatized. A country frozen. He fired from the 32nd floor of a hotel. Into music. Into joy. Into people who had no idea their last song had already begun. He brought in 23 firearms. He smashed the window. He calculated. He aimed. He pulled the trigger. Again and again and again. Then he stopped. No manifesto. No message. No goodbye. Just a silence that echoed louder than the bullets. Stephen Paddock wasn't a monster born in shadows. He was a man who lived among us, who smiled at neighbors, who tipped waiters, who played video poker alone in casinos at midnight. Quiet, invisible, empty.
No one saw it coming. No one understood why.
And yet when I went back through his life, every page, every crack, every silence, I realized something.
The signs were there, not loud, but there. Because violence doesn't begin with a gun.
It begins with something quieter.
A locked room, a cold glance, a voice that never answers back.
What makes a child become a murderer? He was born into silence. Stephen Paddock came into the world in 1953, the son of a woman who struggled to cope, and a man who vanished behind iron bars. His father, Benjamin Paddock, was a bank robber, one of the FBI's most wanted. A man who escaped prison, changed names, abandoned everything.
Stephen never really knew him, just the echoes. At home there was no softness, no stories before bed, no "I'm proud of you." Just the sound of a mother's footsteps. Tired fast, always far away. A tiny house in Arizona, cramped, hot, quiet in all the wrong ways. The living room always smelled of old fabric and secrets. There was a brown teddy bear, once one button eye missing, stitched back with red thread. He kept it in the closet. Not because he loved it, but because no one else ever gave him anything. And sometimes when the walls felt too close, he would lock himself in the bathroom. Sit on the tile floor. Listen. Dishes breaking. Voices arguing. The television flickering with nothing important.
He didn't cry much. He didn't speak much either. By age 6, teachers noted how blank he seemed. Polite, but distant. His eyes wandered too long. His hands stayed too still.
That's when it started. The understanding that no one was coming to save him. That emotions were things better kept underground. That the world was something you survived by vanishing inside yourself. And so, without knowing, the first fracture appeared. A quiet, invisible crack in how he saw the world. Not as a place to love, but a place to endure. School didn't save him. It made things worse. He was the quiet one in the back row, the boy whose name no one really learned. Not because he was strange, but because he blended into the walls too well. Stephen didn't raise his hand. He didn't laugh. He didn't cry when the older kids pushed his books to the floor or whispered names under their breath. Sometimes they just forgot he was there. He walked the hallways like a shadow. His lunch sat untouched. He watched other kids trade sandwiches and secrets while he counted the minutes in silence.
The teachers called him well-behaved.
They didn't see him flinch when someone slammed a locker near his head. They didn't notice when he started drawing small, strange diagrams in the corners of his math notebook. Patterns, angles, rooms with no windows, numbers that added up to something no one else understood. Once a girl tried to talk to him. She smiled. He didn't smile back. After that, she stopped, and so he learned something crucial: invisibility could be useful. If no one saw you, they couldn't hurt you. But they couldn't love you either. He began to resent them for that. Their ease, their noise, their belonging. Each laugh he overheard felt like another nail. Each birthday party he wasn't invited to, another scratch on the inside of his mind. By 12, he stopped looking people in the eye. By 13, he already knew the world didn't want him.
And if they didn't want him,
why should he want them? Puberty didn't come with awkward crushes or rebellious haircuts. It came with silence turning sharp. Stephen started lying, not to impress, but to test. Little things at first, where he'd been, what he'd seen. He'd tell his mother he went to the library, then spend hours staring at a blank wall in the park instead. Watching strangers. imagining lives that weren't his. One day a neighbor's bike went missing. No one suspected him. Another, a younger boy, got pushed in the stairwell. No witnesses, no consequence. At home, he began locking his door, not because he feared anyone, but because it felt powerful. To shut the world out, to keep it guessing. He talked to himself more, not out loud, but in his head. Long monologues. What he would have said. What he would have done if he were bolder, crueler, freer. Inside, a battle had started the part of him that wanted to be touched, to be seen, against the part that wanted control. Love felt weak. Attention felt dangerous.
So he chose control.
He learned to mimic emotion, to nod when someone joked, to ask, "How are you?" without waiting for the answer. It worked. People thought he was just quiet, smart, independent. But behind the polite smile, his thoughts were colder. When a classmate failed a test, he felt no pity. When someone cried, he looked away, not out of discomfort, but because it bored him. By 16, he could make anyone think he was normal. By 17, he stopped trying to be. That's when the mask began to form, not to hide from others, but to protect the emptiness inside. I used to wonder how many people wear a mask for decades. Now I know. Stephen grew into adulthood like a quiet fog there, but not really seen. He got a degree, got jobs, paid taxes, smiled politely at bank tellers. He even had girlfriends, for a while.
He knew how to perform normal.
He could talk about weather, hold a door, make small jokes about late buses and bad coffee.
But inside, nothing grew. No warmth, no real joy. Just a vague awareness that people expected something, and he could provide it like lines in a play.
He didn't drink much. He didn't shout. He didn't punch walls or slam doors. He simply observed, took notes, learned how people connected.
And mimicked it. A colleague once said he was mysterious in a sexy way. She had no idea she was talking to a man who watched everyone and felt nothing. He could pretend to love. He bought gifts, said the right things, but as soon as someone got too close, he pulled back. Or disappeared, because closeness meant being seen. And if they saw him, really saw him, they'd know there was nothing there. He became brilliant at manipulating expectations. People respected his space, admired his independence. No one questioned the long solo trips, the gambling nights, the quiet hours locked in his apartment.
They called it introversion.
But what if it was just a hollow man playing human? He once told a friend, "People like me when I act like them." Then he laughed.
But it wasn't a joke.
It was a warning. There's always a moment.
Not loud, not always violent, but final.
For Stephen, it came slowly, like the drip of a leaky faucet behind drywall, a buildup of quiet humiliations, failures that no one saw but he never forgot. He lost money, again and again, gambling at machines that blinked back at him with empty lights. He'd spend hours alone feeding them, waiting for something to come back. But nothing ever did.
In his 50s, he tried to be a landlord. It didn't last. He moved often. No roots, no home, just rooms, with doors that locked both ways. Then came the hearing loss.
The silence he had grown up with now followed him, literally, his ears buzzing with constant static. Tinnitus, they said, harmless but unending, the kind of noise that could drive a man into himself even deeper. One day a woman he'd been seeing cut things off. She said he was cold, controlling. "You make me feel like I don't exist." He didn't argue.
He just nodded.
And added it to the list. Then came the pills. Anxiety, sleeplessness, restlessness. Then the buying started. He purchased his first gun legally, then another, then 10 more. Modifications, scopes, bipods, calculators, range finders, room bookings, surveillance. It wasn't a snap, it was math.
A cold, deliberate formula, like building a puzzle in the dark. He rented a suite at Mandalay Bay, 2 adjoining rooms, brought bags, so many bags. Security saw him. No one stopped him. He smiled, tipped well.
On the last day, he stared out at the festival crowd, thousands below, singing, laughing, happy. And something broke. This world doesn't care, he thought. So why should I? The next time he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a man. He saw silence dressed like a person. It began at 10:05 p.m.
but in his mind it had started long before.
Stephen sat in that hotel room surrounded by rifles, a drink beside him, cameras wired to the hallway, luggage carefully stacked to block the door, every movement rehearsed, every second calculated, and yet it wasn't chaos inside him. It was quiet. He opened the window with a hammer. Glass shattered into the Vegas night like ice splitting a pond. Down below, music swelled, people sang, lights danced.
They didn't know.
He picked up the rifle with the bipod, scoped, aimed.
And then he fired, not with rage,
with focus. Each shot was methodical, cold, rhythmic.
Like conducting an orchestra no one else could hear.
He didn't scream, he didn't flinch.
He watched bodies drop the way a scientist observes reactions in a lab.
To him, it wasn't murder, it was proof.
Proof that he existed. Proof that he could make the world hear him, if only for once.
He reloaded again and again, over 1,000 rounds into a sea of unknowing faces. The sound echoed across the strip. Panic surged through the crowd. People ran, fell, crawled, screamed. But up there in room 32135, Stephen Paddock stood calm, finally in control, finally the one pulling strings. And when it was done, when the crowd below was broken and sirens began to scream from every corner, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He turned the last weapon on himself,
and for the first time in 64 years, smiled.
The police found him 40 minutes later, dead, alone, laid out beside rifle shells and a handwritten note, cold numbers, calculations, ballistics. No manifesto, no apology, just math. The world demanded a motive, a cause, a reason to make sense of the senseless.
But Stephen left none.
No final words, no video, no message to the world, not even to his family. What he left behind was absence, and the silence that followed was suffocating. His brother looked stunned. He was just a guy, a rich guy. He liked poker. He sent cookies to our mom. But the FBI found more.
Searches for past shootings, purchases of ammunition months in advance, reservations at other concerts abandoned at the last minute.
It wasn't spontaneous.
It was a slow burn, a quiet obsession, built brick by brick in solitude.
His digital footprint showed a man who looked and listened but never engaged. He lived in apartments with blackout curtains, ate alone, traveled alone, slept alone. What grew inside him wasn't hate. It was nothing. And that's harder to catch. There were no cries for help, no outbursts. Just a man who slowly stopped feeling like a person and started becoming an equation. Some think he planned to escape. Others believe he always meant to end it there. But one thing was clear. In those last moments, he wasn't angry.
He was at peace.
And that's the most chilling part. Because peace for some doesn't come from love.
It comes from silence.
And in the end, as police lights painted the hotel walls in red and blue, Stephen Paddock lay still. Not with guilt, but with relief. There was no trial, no cell, no courtroom silence waiting to break.
Stephen Paddock never faced handcuffs.
Instead, society faced a void.
An invisible man had committed the most visible crime in modern U.S. history.
And we were left staring into the gap where his motive should have been. Investigators combed through his life desperate for a crack in the mask, a childhood trauma, a political rant, a religious radicalization, a breakup, a diagnosis. But there was nothing. No ideology, no manifesto, no enemy. Just a man with a passport full of stamps, a garage full of ammunition, and a history full of almosts.
He wasn't a ghost.
He had receipts, schedules, a girlfriend who said he was kind, generous, quiet. He sent her money while she was overseas, told her to buy a house for her family. Hours later, he became a killer. When his face appeared on the news, it wasn't the face people expected.
It wasn't twisted or snarling.
It was bland. A man you wouldn't remember if he passed you on the street.
And maybe that's what terrified us most.
He didn't look like a monster. He looked like us. Like your neighbor, your uncle, the guy at the end of the bar who never talks much.
We couldn't label him, couldn't explain him.
So we called him evil, psychopath, lone wolf.
But maybe the truth is harder to swallow.
Maybe what stared back at us from that hotel room wasn't a demon. Maybe it was a frightened child in the body of a man, one who never found a voice. So he made the world listen, the loudest way he knew how, If someone had noticed the silence earlier, would it have changed anything?
That's the question that haunts me most. Stephen Paddock didn't explode overnight. He unraveled slowly, quietly, and visibly. He wasn't screaming for help. He was fading, shrinking behind routine's politeness numbers. And no one asked why.
We talk about mental illness, but only when it's loud, when it disrupts, when it terrifies. We forget that some of the most dangerous wounds make no sound at all. He didn't kill out of hate, or rage, or politics. He killed because the world felt hollow, and he'd long since decided he didn't belong in it.
He didn't want to be heard. He wanted to matter, and he believed destruction was the only thing loud enough. But this story isn't just about Stephen. It's about the people we don't see,
The ones who drift further and further from connection until they no longer recognize their own reflection. It's about the child who sits alone at lunch, the man who stares too long at the ground, the woman who laughs without her eyes. The warning isn't in the gunfire. It's in the years before the cracks we dismiss the questions we never asked. This crime didn't begin on the 32nd floor. It began in a locked bedroom,
in a forgotten hallway, in 100 missed moments when someone could have said, "I see you."
So next time you notice someone disappearing, say something.
because there are others like him, waiting in the silence,
Hoping anyone might hear them
before it's too late.